another announcement. We have a brand new board member who was elected recently, and it's Shannon Heck, who's right here in front. Let's welcome Shannon. And then some housekeeping measures. Please remember that only questions are allowed by the members of the working press or actual members of the press club. So please abide by that rule. And if you have a cell phone with you, make sure it's turned off or on vibrate so it won't be interrupted. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker.
Thanks.
John Couvillon is our speaker today, and he has a lifelong fascination with politics, particularly with analysis of voter election data, redistricting, and polling. John formally launched his political consulting business, JMC Enterprises, also known as JMC Analytics, in 2010. His business provides strategic consulting services to candidates, issue advocacy groups, and governmental entities. To date, John has worked with candidates in 36 states and who have been elected to offices ranging from congressional to local offices. He was born in Baton Rouge, and where he lives now most of his life, and he lives here with his wife of 19 years. Let's go ahead and welcome John Couvillon.
First off, thanks very much for having me here today. I want to start off with some good news, given that Louisiana has been subject to almost, it seems like, a daily barrage of bad news from weather to other events. One of the things that I just found out from the Department of Health, which updates its coronavirus information on a daily basis, back in late July with the Delta variant, we had reached an ungodly high of 3,022 hospitalizations in the state of Louisiana. That number has been falling, by the way, for the last 39 of the last 40 days. I'm happy to say today that 3,022 is, as of today, 984. That is the first time, I want to say since early to mid-July, that we've actually been below 1,000. So that's something that we should be grateful for, because Lord knows the Delta variant, as I would argue, was worse than waves 3, waves 2, and it was probably on par with wave 1 in terms of severity. So I'm just very grateful to see that data that is continually trending in the right direction. Having said that, one of the things I'd like to talk about today, given that it is political season, whether we agree with that premise or not, I want to talk about three things. The first is, this is the looking back part that was part of the title of my talk today, talking about the California recall, a couple of things I've observed. I'd also like to talk about, when looking forward, of course I saved Louisiana, the best for last, but the second part in the middle, I'd like to talk about not just the midterm elections, as it were, in Virginia, New Jersey this year, but the midterm elections we'll have next year, because there's certain things that I look for and have things I can comment about with regards to those elections. So having said that, let's start with California. So California, as many of you may realize, recently underwent a recall election, the second of its kind since 2003, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was brought into office. In this case, the incumbent governor survived by an overwhelming margin, and since he survived by an overwhelming margin, of course, the second part of the recall ballot in California, which is, who do you want to replace the governor? Well, that question is moot. A couple things that are of interest in that race. The first thing is, California is truly a unique state, and whenever I think of the Beach Boys song, Mamas and Papas, my bad, California Dreaming, I am tempted to talk about California counting, given that they have loose rules with regards to the mail-in ballots and when they may be accepted, and worse yet, if you're an election administrator, they take a month to count, and thus far, when we started off on election night, 9 million mail-in ballots have been counted, and recall is failing with 64%. Since then, an additional 3.5 million mail-in ballots have been counted. The anti-recall sentiment of that batch dropped from 64 to 58%. In other words, some people were thinking perhaps there was this secret cache of recall ballots that was going to overturn the result. Well, it didn't. And so given that you have 12.5 million votes are counted, and according to my calculations, we're talking about another 500,000 to count, where I don't think the numbers would change greatly. We're looking at 62% as of today that were against recalling Governor Gavin Newsom. One of the things I also found interesting as I'm talking about kind of the lessons learned from that episode, the first is, one of the things that they did, the Democrats / Governor Newsom in California did very, very well, was not only make this a partisan issue. In other words, they shifted the discussion from what you thought about Governor Newsom's performance to this is a Republican recall, and they let one of the candidates, his name was Larry Elder, basically he was let's just say he said quite a few controversial things and had a controversial past, and as a result of that, the fulcrum of the California recall shifted from it being approval or disapproval of Governor Newsom to a Democrat on Republican race, which in the state of California is pretty much going to be guaranteed a Democratic result. And you know, one of the things I thought that was interesting too, in addition to the fact that it was made a partisan issue, was the fact that Governor Newsom's people successfully convinced a substantial number of people to just skip. Even though you had, I think it was 6 or 8 Democrats on the replacement ballot, Governor Newsom and his people successfully convinced 43% of those turning in a mail-in ballot to flat out skip the second question. That level of party unanimity I found breathtaking, to be honest with you, because normally it's very hard to convince voters to do that kind of coordinated action, but to have nearly half the electorate decide they weren't even going to vote on the second question, I found that interesting, and I think that goes back again to what I was saying about this became a partisan issue with Larry Elder becoming the opponent as opposed to some other Republicans who ran who I think could have generated more of a protest vote against the governor. I think too that the implications of 2022, it's always kind of reaching whenever you try to extrapolate too much from a single election. But one of the things I think is applicable when you're talking about California as well as Virginia, New Jersey in a month, and in the midterm elections in the fall of 2022, is that what I've seen is since 1992 is that our nation has become much more polarized in terms of you have a lot more people voting straight ticket nowadays, meaning if they're going to vote Democratic or Republican at the top of the ballot, they're going to vote that way going all the way down. It's not like the old days where you might have had someone who had been comfortable voting with Ronald Reagan and Russell Long or Ronald Reagan and John Brewer or people like that. You're talking about people that are pretty much voting party line. Now, what the implication is of that when you're talking about the 2022 elections is that if you have a state that is above a certain percent Democratic or Republican, and the number I like to use is in the 55 to 57% range, that pretty much means you're not going to see a partisan shift. So if you're talking about, say, a Rhode Island or Massachusetts, I would fully expect that they're going to vote Democratic for governor next year. Similarly, if you're talking about Alabama, I would expect Republicans to have little incident in getting reelected, just because that's the nature of our partisan politics nowadays. And because of that partisanship, which is kind of thoroughly interwoven itself from beginning to end of the election cycle, you kind of can predict what the election result will be in these partisan states. What that also means, however, and this is where I deliberately like to be at variance with supposed conventional wisdom, you do have independents who are in the middle. You notice I said 55 to 57%. What that means in plain terms is if you have a state that is not substantially Democratic or substantially Republican, independents can and do change their mind between the presidential election and the midterm. And that changing of their mind does affect the election results, as we've seen in wave years of either party. So that's what I see as happening. And the final thought about California before I move on to Virginia and New Jersey is that I think what indirectly benefited Governor Newsom as well is that even though the Delta variant was taking hold in California like it was in other states, he did not touch the issue of restrictions at all. So basically, he defanged that politically as an issue that could have been used against him. And I think that that's going to be potentially an issue next year in the midterm elections is a governor's conduct with regards to coronavirus restrictions. So having talked about California, let's shift to Virginia and New Jersey. Believe it or not, they are already early voting in Virginia. And numbers I've seen are very unimpressive in terms of the turnout. And the thing about the Virginia race, which is interesting to me, and really New Jersey too, when I look at these elections, even though you would stereotypically expect the Democrats to win those states because of the fact that they voted for Joe Biden and they voted for Hillary Clinton, one of the things I have seen with these two states is if you have a wave election, the distant early warning, as it were, can be felt in states like Virginia and New Jersey. What that means in plain terms is, given that the census was conducted so late, the legislative elections in those states are actually being conducted using 2011 and not 2021 legislative district lines, because of course Virginia and New Jersey, like what Louisiana will do in 2 years, they have legislative elections in sync with statewide elections. So they're actually using 10-year-ago district lines, meaning that despite the fact that the Democrats are currently dominant in those states, the lines have not yet been drawn by the Democrats. And so if I see big Republican gains in those states and or an upset in the Virginia governor's race, I think it is acceptable conversation to talk about the size of the Republican wave. As it is right now, my opinion is I see this as basically your typical midterm election, which means the party out of power would gain some. The question then becomes quantitatively, what is some? Are we talking 5 House seats, 25 House seats? The good and bad news about that, if you're a Democrat, is that, I'll start with the bad news. You don't really, you as the Democrats, being that you have 50 people in the Senate with only Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote and 220 in the House, there's very low margin for error in terms of partisan seat changes. So the Democrats don't really have far to fall, as it were, if there is the issue of their losing one or both houses of Congress. Now I'll discuss that shortly. So that's kind of what I see as happening in Virginia, New Jersey. Is I'm specifically looking at not just the statewide elections, but any legislative trends in terms of did the Republicans pick up an appreciable number of seats in the Virginia House and or the New Jersey legislature as a way of seeing what will happen next year. Because by the way, in 1993, in 2009, and 2017, I saw big partisan gains in those states in what seemingly would have been an innocent off-year election. So those elections do matter. So that's one thing I'm going to be keeping my eye on, and of course I'll be posting appropriately on social media as to what I see. Now when we talk about Congress for the 2022 midterm, so I'm moving further into the future now, I'll start with the House. I think the odds are more likely than not that the Republicans will pick up the House, given that the Democrats don't really have many seats they can lose. And there's one statistic which I think should give the Democrats quite a bit of pause. That statistic is 36 winning, let me back half a step. Democrats right now have 220 out of 435 seats, plus 2 vacant seats, which they almost certainly will pick up when they hold the special elections. So basically, you only have a 5-seat flip from 222. That puts you in the minority, and the House is a situation where you either have 100% of the power or 0% of the power, depending on who has 218 votes. Now, the one statistic which I think should give the Democrats quite a bit of pause is when I looked at the winning percentages of Democratic House congressional candidates, I found that 36 Democrats were elected by less than a 10-point margin. In other words, a margin of single digits, in my opinion, when you're talking about a midterm electorate as opposed to a presidential year electorate, you could have quite a bit of swing in terms of people who are showing up for the presidential election no longer appear, and if you're a party in power, you typically aren't as enthused, and you again have the influence of independents. So right away, the Democrats need to be worried about the exposure of having 36 candidates who won by less than 10 points. Even more, I guess, cautious for the Democrats, of those 36 seats, 19 of those 36 were won by the Democratic candidate by less than 5 points. So you're talking about a lot of races that, in my opinion, enthusiasm for Biden or dislike of Trump, depending on your political point of view, put those candidates over the top. And you're not going to have that next year because, of course, you won't have a presidential election on the ballot. So that is why I believe the Democrats are in trouble in the House. Then we go to the Senate, and I'm actually going to defy conventional wisdom and say that it's, in my opinion, a toss-up. Because even though you technically have 50 Democratic seats and 50 Republican seats, which is only being broken by Vice President Kamala Harris's vote, the plain reality about the Senate is, number one, you do not have all 100 senators up for re-election next year. You have 34. And of those 34, 20 of those 34 are Republican seats. So you have a lot less Democratic exposure in this particular election cycle. I'm going to go a step further, and with those 34 seats, we already have 5 vacancies in terms of Republicans announcing that they're not going to run again. And when those vacancies are in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and possibly Wisconsin, the quality of the Republican nominee and or the Democratic nominee matters a lot. So given that you have a shaky hold on several Republican-held seats, and when I look at the 14 Democrats who are up for re-election in the Senate next year, I can only count a handful who, in my opinion, are vulnerable. The first 2 are the Democrats who won in Arizona and Georgia, and in my opinion, Joe Biden put them over the top. But then you really have to stretch to find any other Democrats who are vulnerable, and in that stretch, I found that Nevada and New Hampshire, if the Republicans nominate a current governor who's thinking of running, those are the only 4 possible seats I see Republicans could win. So you're talking about the mathematics of up to 4 vulnerable Democrats and likely 4 Republican-held seats that are shaky. Unless you have a strong Republican wave, it's not out of the question to have a 1 or 2 seat Democratic pickup, or you can have a 1 or 2 seat Republican pickup. So really in that scenario, I'm more interested in what the candidate quality is going to be. In other words, are they the Republicans picking a nominee who is politically maladroit, or are they picking someone who has a lot of experience and knows how to connect with the voters? And of course, we still have to wait because primaries do not start until March, when Texas and North Carolina have their primaries, and of course, from there, we're going to have primaries all into next summer. So that's one issue where if I'm invited at future press club appearances and I'm asked about what I think about the U.S. Senate, I'm going to give the same response then that I'm giving now about the U.S. Senate, which is I like to reserve judgment before seeing not only the quality of the Democratic and Republican candidates, but the other thing I like to look at when you're talking about if I think there is a wave, and if so, how much, what is the level of partisan enthusiasm in terms of the Democratic and Republican turnout in the primaries? In other words, I have data going all the way back to 2006 where in Democratic years, I've seen Democratic primary turnout off the charts relative to a previous midterm cycle. In a Republican year, similarly, I've seen elevated Republican turnout. So that's one of those things, again, it's intangible. I don't have a good feel for right now, but as we get into the spring and summer, I will. So that is a to be continued, but I think that the big takeaway here when we're talking about the U.S. congressional races next year is more likely than not the Republicans would take the House back from the Democrats. The Senate is very much a toss-up just because of not only the Republican predominance of those 34 senators who are up, but the fact that you have several open seats in what are not securely Republican areas. So definitely to be continued there. Then I saved the best for last, the races here in the great state of Louisiana. So topping the ballot would be 4 constitutional amendments. One deals with the work related to sales tax streamlining that the commission did, and it's now a constitutional amendment that we put forward to voters. You have an income tax swap. That'll probably be the most prominent of the 4 amendments, where you're talking about, of the many deductions that there are in the tax code, taking away the deduction for federal income taxes from your state income taxes, and in exchange, getting a reduction in the state tax you have to pay. So it's basically, the idea is we're simplifying taxes by taking away deduction and giving the change to the voters, as it were, in the form of lower state income tax rates. You also have an issue about the ability of levy boards to levy a tax. And then finally, there is an issue of whether there can be an additional cut to statutorily dedicated funds. So those 4 amendments are on the ballot. The thing that I would caution people about when they're trying to read anything into these amendment tax elections is to understand the context under which this election is being held. First off, it's being delayed by a month because of the destruction that Hurricane Ida had created here in Louisiana. The other thing too, which I do think is a big cautionary note for anybody who try to handicap these tax elections, is when you're talking about esoteric materials such as sales tax streamlining and income tax swaps and so forth, you really have to make an effort to educate the voters as to what the implications are of those changes to be able to get favorable passage. Because one sentiment you can and do have, and I personally know somebody who turned in his mail-in ballot, and I'll leave the name out to protect the innocent, he basically told me he voted no on all 4 amendments, and his attitude was, well, I think we've got too much stuff in the Constitution already. So when you're talking about that default instinct, which is to vote no if you're not completely conversant on what the issues are, that is a big red flag in my opinion in terms of trying to handicap amendment elections. There's another intangible too, which I think is worth discussing. And in discussing this, let's go back to 2017 when we had a treasurer's race, the one that John Schroeder won in the runoff. Normally, Orleans Parish contributes about 8% of the statewide vote. In the case of the treasurer's runoff, because you had the mayoral runoff for New Orleans at the same time as the statewide runoff for the treasurer's race, Orleans Parish actually cast 22% of the statewide vote. In other words, for an election that was as low wattage as the treasurer's special election was, combine that with a medium interest election in New Orleans, the city of New Orleans punched way above its weight in terms of how many votes it cast as a percentage of the statewide total. That kind of phenomenon, I would not say is out of the question this time, because you're talking about something that is not in itself going to be a turnout draw to voters, and that's something, of course, is going to go vote for 4 constitutional amendments. If you're in the city of New Orleans, you have an additional excuse to go vote. That is all of the Orleans Parish specific races there are. And so if Orleans Parish is overwhelmingly one way or another with regards to the amendments, if you're casting 22% of the statewide vote versus 8%, oh, you very much have the ability to possibly impact the outcome of those amendment elections. The other things that there are on the ballot, once we talk about after the statewide race, we have 3 legislative elections. One is in the House in a seat up in Monroe and Bastrop. Only Democrats are running there, so no suspense there. You have another House race down in Algiers, New Orleans. Again, Democrats should win that easily. Then you have a special election for state senate. When Ronnie Johns got appointed to the Gambling Control Board, that created an open state senate seat. You actually do have a bona fide partisan contest there. That district, which is basically Lake Charles and surrounding suburbs, it leans Republican, but more to the point, it has a Democratic heritage and typically votes the same way the state does, which means that if John Bel Edwards wins statewide, he most likely and did carry the votes of Senate District 27 twice. And if you had Bill Cassidy and Donald Trump get elected statewide, similarly, Senate District 27 voted the same way. So that is the one race of those 3 legislative special elections where you do have a bona fide partisan contest. Here in Baton Rouge, we have a couple of family court judges. We have the CATS tax is being renewed. And tax renewals typically are less of an incident than putting a tax on the ballot can be. But nevertheless, when you're talking about an election cycle where already it's been pushed back a month and you're talking about nothing else being a real turnout generator, again, you're talking about a small percentage of voters who could theoretically impact the outcome disproportionately. So those are the thoughts that I have about the just completed California recall elections, as well as what I see happening this fall in Virginia, New Jersey, and here in Louisiana, as well as the midterm elections next year. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
With the tax bills, the lawmakers, they were really touting that, saying it was historic, that they had been working for this for so long. But as you're saying, it sounds like it's going to be kind of a struggle to get people to vote for this. So, you know, with this being such a historical bill that came through, do you think that that could potentially garner more attention from voters?
The thing about tax bills is you have to remember that what is interesting to those who live inside of I-110 versus those living in the rest of Baton Rouge and or the state of Louisiana are two entirely different things. In other words, there's a question as to how tuned in all these other constituencies are about the fact that you have a historic tax swap. And the thing about these tax swaps is that the last two I recall, there's been others, but the two that immediately come to mind when you're talking about voters going one way versus another, you had the Stelly Plan in 2002, which was passed and was a tax swap. It quickly became apparent, however, that given the income tax impacts on middle and upper income individuals, it quickly became unpopular and was repealed several years after that. And going all the way back to 1989, when Governor Buddy Roemer had a then Governor Buddy Roemer had a fiscal reform package on the ballot, which pretty much was a standalone, meaning you didn't have a governor's race or senate race or anything like that. That was one that, because of the tendency just to vote no, it went down 55-45. So the way I look at these tax elections is you still have to do the necessary educating of the voters so that they know what they're voting for or against. And tax swaps are very complicated things to explain to the voters because the devil's in the detail with regards to who would benefit and who would not. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. I've actually been able to do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Ever since the night of November 3rd, 2020, the results of the election have been challenged. It's resulted in allegations, litigations, investigations, the most recent being the Arizona recount, where it comes out President Biden actually got more votes and President Trump lost votes. Now they are apparently going to go to Texas and investigate that election where Trump won. And so I'm wondering, is this actually to contest the election or just to cause a lack of integrity in the electoral process? So that if you lose, then you're just going to have the grounds to say, well, you know, the election was fraudulent, even though the ballot contained several elections. Nobody seems to be contesting any of the congressional elections that were on the same ballot as the presidential election. So is this actually to challenge the votes or just throw the integrity of the election into question?
The actions which you're describing have the potential of being very disruptive. Because I remember going all the way back to Bush versus Gore in 2000, when every day there was a back and forth of litigation. And the thing was, about the only thing that ultimately stopped all this back and forthing was the fact that you had a deadline for Florida's electors to be selected. So in a situation like this, technically you don't really have a deadline as to how long you want to keep contesting things. And so I just think that it's very dangerous if you're going to automatically decide beforehand that you don't like the results. Kind of like what happened when Larry Elder was setting up a fraud unit, and then of course it ended up being unnecessary given the wide margin by which Governor Newsom kept his job. But I just think you have to be very careful in terms of instigating those actions unless you have substantial knowledge of fraud, just because what's to stop the other side from doing the same thing? And we could be investigating Massachusetts and Rhode Island and California. In other words, you have to be targeted and focused as to where you have these kinds of things. And one of the things that I saw, and again, I like pointing out things that don't really get much coverage, but that's just a bad habit I have, is that way back in August of 2020, you'll remember there was controversy over then Postmaster Louis DeJoy And it had to do with the question of whether the Postal Service could adequately handle the expected rush of mail-in ballots. And one of the things that I saw from that controversy was that, in my opinion, it lit the fuse, so to speak, to get Democrats to vote even earlier. Because one of the things I was seeing, we talk about late August, early September, mail-in ballots started to be turned in at an accelerated rate. And one of the things too about those mail-in ballots, let me explain that 2020 was a special situation. Whether you agree with the decision these chief executives made across America or not, the fact was the pandemic did create a sufficient amount of concern with regards to people possibly going into a super spreader event at the polls, to where a lot of states basically threw open mail-in voting wide. Before that, mail-in voting wasn't really going anywhere. I mean, you had a handful of states that had it, but all of a sudden you had places like New York and California and all that going 100% mail. And in some cases, particularly New York, they did not have the necessary infrastructure to do so. So what I'm going with this question is that when I saw that this controversy was going on about the post office and possibly not being able to handle all the mail-in ballots, I saw that as giving the Democrats a free messaging point, as it were, to get their people to vote early. And when I was seeing these overlarge Democratic numbers in states like Pennsylvania, where normally the voter registration is about +5 Democratic, and I was seeing 3-to-1 Democratic edges in voter registration going all the way back to September, I'm thinking, okay, I hope the Republicans are doing something to counteract this, because you have votes being turned in 2 months before the election. We could have an honest debate about whether that's wise to decide so soon. The point being was it was happening, and because some jurisdictions were not allowed adequate time to adjudicate the ballots before they could run them through the scanner, I think that created further confusion. So the point being is, I'm always very reluctant to start assuming there's fraud unless you have really good evidence of, hey, here are the irregularities, we went to court, we were able to prove in a court of law that there were these irregularities, and therefore we need to do these corrective actions. Absent that, I'm just very reluctant to start messing with the fabric of elections, because, you know, one of the things that I had a Republican operative tell me, and this is for Republicans an unfortunate side effect, is if you want to create a lack of confidence as to whether an election being held is legitimate, okay, that's one thing. However, you have to remember that if your own voters do not have confidence in that same election, that also means they're not going to turn out in high numbers. So in effect, it is real voter suppression. So point being is I'm just very, very cautious about people wanting to assume fraud when it's just an old-fashioned election loss.
Ask this hypothetically, okay? You've talked about the huge gap between Republicans and Democrats. We are polarized.
Yes.
Then you had Bill Cassidy, who has supported criminal charges against Trump with January 6th fallout, and he has been seen with Biden in different, conferences regarding the infrastructure bill. Which, I mean, granted, that kind of unity is really sorely needed, but in a state like Louisiana, which is rather polarized, what kind of effect do you see that having, whenever he goes up for re-election?
Well, it's certainly a challenge that Senator Cassidy in the short term will have to deal with, because you're talking about a state, even in polls I've done after the election, I've seen that President Trump is still a very popular figure here in Louisiana, and his 58% that he got last year is identical to the 58% of the vote that he received in 2016. So what that means is you have to be very careful about just the very strong loyalty I see about President Trump. If you are Senator Cassidy, to me the best thing that you could possibly do is, okay, you had your reasons for voting the way you did, but it's absolutely imperative to mend fences with Republicans, because you certainly don't want them being upset at you 5 years from now. Because a similar dynamic on a different level of, I don't want to say severity, but let's just say the constitutional implications were entirely different. When Mary Landrieu had voted for Obamacare in 2009, one of the things that I saw happen was her poll numbers were pretty much irrevocably damaged from then on, and it was not like she was reelected in 2008 by a large margin. So point being is big votes like that catch people's attention, you have to be very careful against going against the grain, and if you are, you better have a good reason for doing so, and make sure to mend fences, because he does have 5 years to do that. But I think the mending fences aspect is the most critical part of what Senator Cassidy needs to do, in addition, of course, to doing the constituent services and other things that are expected of a congressman.
I know it's only midway through Governor Edwards' term, but would you care to lay out do you see any GOP challengers beyond Nungesser and Landry? And also, if you would mind, could you maybe speculate on who you think may carry the Democratic flag for governor in 2023?
So the two halves of this question, one would be possible Republican challengers other than Nungesser and Landry, and the second would be the Democratic standard bearer. Democratic standard bearer, that to me is a fairly cut and dry question to ask. You do have, as I understand, State Senator Gary Smith from Norco, and I would certainly not discount other Democrats of varying levels of the political food chain, as it were, jumping in. On the Republican side, to me, for an election that conveys as much power as the governorship does, I don't see that you would have only a 2 Republican contest. That's an awful long time to have a governor's race between just 2 people. As to the who could possibly run, I'm always careful about engaging in speculation, but if you are of a stature to where you're having to go on TV regularly because, let's say, you're a public service commissioner or a congressman, and therefore you have one or more media markets in your district, those types of elected officials logically have to be considered in terms of who could be a governor, because they immediately have some degree of name recognition. And you can make the same argument about legislators. In legislators' cases, of course, you have a much higher bar to clear, and that is you've got to get known in your immediate area first before you can even contemplate going statewide. Now, you can, of course, say, well, John Bel Edwards had the same challenge in 2015, and yes, he did. However, he was the only Democrat running, number one. And number two, I think that his being the only Democrat automatically gave him a certain percentage of the vote that basically freed him up to spend the balance of his time appealing to soft Republicans and or independents to get to 50% of the vote. So I believe there's going to be more people jumping into the governor's race, because after all, 2023, we're still talking 2 years away. I see a window of probably about 14 to 15 more months where someone could still jump in and not be quote unquote behind. And those are the types of candidates who I would see as being possible contenders on the Republican side statewide. Oh, yes.
And so to that point, you mentioned Nungesser and Landry.
Yes.
Do you see anybody else?
Yes, the anybody else was when I was talking about congressmen and PSC members and those who, because of the size of the constituency that they represent, they have to have a media campaign if they want to get elected and or re-elected. So what that means in plain terms is that a Republican member of the PSC, or Democratic, but we're talking about the Republican side, a Republican member of the PSC and or any of 5 Republican congressmen could theoretically jump in the race for governor because they have the stature to do so.
All right, John, thank you.
He's not there.